I'm gonna be completely honest and say I much more enjoyed connecting with people more so than I have performing.
Throughout all my years as an online musical hipster, I've probably listened to countless artists and even more albums while perusing the landfill that we call music. And while most that's left in obscurity belongs to stay just that, I've found a lot of unsung musical heroes and records that never got the love or audience that they deserved. And today I want to talk about someone who came very close, but sadly, for one reason or another, fell himself headfirst into obscurity, leaving behind one of the greatest albums ever written and becoming, well, a shadow of their former self. One that, in my opinion, shows just how far you can push the limitations of music and create a piece of art so powerful and so compelling it can change the way that you perceive music itself. So let's talk about the one and only Nick Zanca, aka Mr. Lies.
Howdy everybody, this is Nick Zanca recording from the Music Tech Room. I'm here today to showcase some of my blueprints and ideas for musical scoring for the TV broadcasting program at NCHS, along with what tools and systems I used and how I implemented them into my projects. I will also show what songs or themes inspired me in composing these sort of jingles. Hope y'all enjoy.
Mr. Lies is a moniker that has sadly been abandoned. Once being a bright example of someone taking more mainstream sensibilities and wrapping them back up into interesting avant-garde pieces, he now goes by his birth name Nick Zanca and focuses on creating purely experimental and challenging soundscapes. Though drastic changes in sound, style, and tone are nothing new to Nick, even under the name Mr. Lies, he constantly shifted sounds and styles even across individual songs on his records. Just take a listen to these two offerings from his debut, Mowgli. The song Dionysid has a much more straightforward take on downbeat techno. Something that wouldn't sound too out of place on a machine drum release, only for the album to take a total shift later with the song Hounded, a haunting track focusing on emotional ambiances, space, and pitched vocal samples. Even before the release of Mowgli, or any coverage he received online, Mr. Lies had put out some hits with songs like False Astronomy and Clean, gaining millions of views on YouTube and even earning himself a live session on Audio Tree.
Good afternoon and welcome to Audio Tree Live on this serendipitous Tuesday, June 18th, 2013. Thanks to our sponsors, The Music Garage, Emperor Cabs, and Pretzel Crisps. We are so stoked to have in the studio with us today, Mr. Lies.
From all this early success and experimentation, it really shouldn't have been a surprise that Mr. Lies was never going to be the type to just sell out. Although it's this self-assurance and pride that might have been his downfall, and while hindsight is 20/20 and we can sit in our high horses and judge him for the choices that he made, I actually think that's very admirable that Nick was brave enough to continue his artistic evolution and not just stick to his bread and butter sounds in order to chase star power. Rather than release the same song and hundreds of remixes of it like other big producers, Nick was always experimenting, trying out new things, and honestly, a lot of the times, hitting it on the head with a nail and creating some pretty powerful stuff. And after the release of Mowgli, we would see just that. Nick would disappear for a fair bit of time, bunkering himself in his New York apartment, working on what would become his second full-length record and his magnum opus.
It's kind of like a funny subject. It's kind of like a loaded question because
Yeah,
like
for sure.
on the next record, I'm gonna be singing on it a lot more,
okay.
kind of like I did at the beginning of my set. And I'm gonna start. I have to start thinking a lot more about lyrics. I'm actually, when I start writing it, I've kind of decided to give myself the restriction of starting on actual instruments, writing it, and then separate, and then like sort of divorcing the writing process from the recording process.
Shadow is an album that deserved to be adored by millions and looked at as a defining moment in the world of music. But sadly, due to it coming from an at-the-time up-and-coming EDM artist known mostly for his lush ambient EDM songs, it was met with mixed reviews upon release and ultimately faded into obscurity. Nick treated us to his second Mr. Lies record in 2014, an album easily defined by its striking yet simple artwork. The sound of the record is extremely varied, starting off with an ambient piece called Nymph that leads us onto an 8-minute journey. Rather than setting the tone for the record, it actually just pulls you into the world of Mr. Lies, seeing it all through the eyes of the artist. The song is powerful and doesn't feel nearly as long as it actually is, a testament to just how good of an intro Nymph is able to be. It's on track 2 where we finally hear the voice of Mr. Lies, carrying itself above a much more pop-oriented indie-tronica track. Deep End might be a curveball right out the gate, but it by no means feels left field. In fact, it feels perfect, giving us a reprieve from the heaviness of Nymph and allowing us to stew on the lyrics Nick sings for us. I won't drown happily. They are the deep end, and I forgot how to breathe. Don't hold me up now, I would drown happily. If the overall sound and dark yet intimate atmosphere of the music wasn't enough to clue you in, these lyrics should seal the deal. Shadow is an album about reflection, pain, bitterness, and confusion, but not in a self-loathing or preachy way. It really nails subject matter in a way that I haven't seen many others pull off, and that's almost purely due to just how great the songwriting and vocal performances are. All of this is expanded upon with track 3, New Wolf, a song where the music takes a back seat and Nick tells us of a broken relationship, referencing past admiration, but a continued will to leave it all behind.
I look at photographs you took and pretend I'm in them, but nothing here is going to stop.
The production on this track really steals the show though. Complementing the lyrics and building as the story Nick tells gets thicker. It's the first time we really get a taste of just how bitter the album can get, and in a twisted way, the song feels like it's both about a relationship as well as a reflection on how Nick feels about himself. I'm amazed that you'd still share the bed, but I'm not bitter. While I resist the urge to laugh, you smoke down to the filter. This is why we can't have nice things. Is this really what you wanted? A brutal reflection that feels more like a double-edged takedown of both Nick's partner and his own ego. But we'll come back to that later. It's here where we meet a song that takes the cake in experimental perfection. A Room Without was actually my introduction to Mr. Lies, and from the first blip and bloop that makes up the pounding drum beat of the song, I was in love with it. But loud and noisy isn't what this track is actually about. Rather, it quickly surrounds itself in an airy ambiance, distant voices, and Nick's hypnotic vocals.
Fill in the room. Knew that you would wake up, and you'd hear this
Without actually holds my favorite lyric off the record, and one that I think can define the album. What happens now that the voice that you pray to is praying back? It's a simple but powerful line, and it recontextualizes a lot of what we've heard from the record at this point, making New Wolf and Deep End really feel more like tracks reflecting on their author, with all the titles playing more on each other, but we'll come back to that later. A Room Without is followed by the song High, Shadow's most straightforward and stripped down track.
Show a little backbone. These 3 bones barely cut.
The more stripped down nature feels like a rebirth of sorts, where Nick sings over an E-piano playing somber but powerful chords over a simple but glitchy beat. The lyrics on this track really reflect the darkness and insecurity of whatever situation Nick is singing about. Within your indecision, see nothing's turned to dust. Yeah, sure, I let you back before, these ribbons barely knot. Tell me, is this hurting now? The song is truly touching, and its breakdown is, well, it still gets me, and it's something you have to experience at least once if you're a fan of music. The next song on the record is Pill, a track that continues with the more stripped down nature of High, but allows itself to play a bit more with the glitchy samples and chopped up bass lines, serving as its rhythm section.
Too much time spent tonight holding your breath, so I'll die, and you'll turn me inside out.
Like High, the song is a bit more straightforward, but less as a means to give a reprieve, and more as a way for the vocals to take center stage. The song's chorus is the phrase, "Turn me inside out," and if you were listening closely during Nymph, you could even hear it sung before the song's final drop. This is another lyric that really directs the listener to the theme of bitterness and self-reflection. It can be taken as another song about a broken relationship, however, it can also be taken as how Nick might feel about himself. Stuck/Ouija is the second to last song on the record and brings back more of the strange experimentation Shadow has played us in spades. The first half of the track plays like a groovy song about always finding yourself in turmoil, only for the track halfway through to completely stop and transition into a wall of lush and airy sounds, not too dissimilar to what Nick does now.
When a person is dead, that person cannot think about things. They cannot feel any hurt. They cannot feel hot.
During this transition, a voice talks about what it's like when someone dies and how everything about that person stops and fades away. It's a cinematic and moving moment before the album comes to its conclusion with its final track, Push Becoming Shove. Now, let's talk about how you close a record. Push Becoming Shove is the perfect way to end an album like this, not by just fading out in what would seem to be a closing moment like the previous song, but with this. The song is an experimental electronica track with some of the most bitter and jaded lyrics we've heard yet. My legs were both broken at birth. Excuse me if I should stand up. Talk about dark. The song concludes with a crescendo of noisy synths and vocal samples getting louder and more distorted as the track goes on, only for it all to end on the song fading into the first few seconds of the album's opening track, Nymph. And with that, the album concludes. I've been talking about it throughout most of the video, but let's really dig into what this album is actually about. From all the lyrical snippets I pulled, it's pretty telling, but I do recommend you listen to the record for yourself to get the full experience. Shadow's meaning is in the name itself, Shadow. Nick Zanca is singing to himself on this record, and while some songs easily sound like they could be about an ex-lover, If you listen closely to his word choices and the phrasing, it becomes clear that he's reflecting on himself. Even the track names offer this up. The title of the track, Nymph, could easily be looked at as a reference to women, but its lesser-known definition is actually about insects. According to dictionary.com, it means a larva of an insect with incomplete metamorphosis that differs from the imago, especially in size and its incompletely developed wings and genitalia. Nymph itself is a song that feels incomplete, starting up only to fade away and start again within the first 2 minutes, and it develops even further before fading down and abruptly jumping into the next track. Deep End in its title alone is a double play on words. It's spelled like deep end as if it's the deeper side of a pool, but in the song it's used in context of dependence. The song's lyrics tell of someone obviously living in an unfulfilled life, having a hard time accepting themselves and their loss of friends, meaningful relationships, and fulfillment in real life, going as far as to say that they wouldn't mind just drowning. And as we already talked about New Wolf, it's a bitter self-reflection of frustration and disgust, with the song ending on Nick's choice to leave that version of himself behind. A Room Without is all about change, realizing that it's time to change but struggling with making that final decision. And this is further expanded upon with High, where Nick sings all about his indecision and discontentment. Pill continues this as well, but reaches a much different conclusion than what you would expect. Rather than fully embrace change, Nick begs to be turned inside out, a line that I believe to be a metaphor of being forced into a situation that causes you to change and now reflect what you truly are on the inside. And while this is still an embrace to make a difference, it sounds less like acceptance and more like a desperate cry for help. And the album's conclusion builds upon this with Stuck and Ouija, breaking down, talking about death, and the mean-spirited and cynical lyrics of Push Becoming Shove, showing just where Nick is at by the end of the record, all before it fades out and cycles back to the beginning of Nymph. Shadow is almost a musical Ouroboros, if you will, a vicious cycle that Mr. Lies can't escape, and with its masterful production and songwriting, it truly is one of the greatest albums ever written. After Shadow's lukewarm and honestly disappointing reception, Nick would slow down his output and go quiet for a few years, reappearing later to promote his new band Quiet Friend and release an album with them and do a few production gigs here and there. He would later come back in 2018 to put out a few new singles under the Mr. Lies name, and later put out his self-titled record in 2019, bidding farewell to the moniker. The final Mr. Lies album is, well, without sounding like a complete asshole, it's a bit of a disappointment. It has a few moments of brilliance like the intro and the god-tier song The Commuter. I mean, come on, this is one of the catchiest things I've ever heard in my life. But for the most part, the album feels unfinished and carries a sense of bitterness to it. But not an artistic one like we saw with Shadow, but a genuine frustration and growing hatred for the music itself. The album really feels like it was kind of phoned in at certain points, never truly embracing the vocals or instrumentation entirely. And with that, the Mr. Lies name died with a whimper. Nick has gone on to make a name for himself as a producer and ghostwriter, as well as rebranding himself under his birth name. Though I would also be lying if I said his new music was something I was all that much of a fan of. Earlier this year, Nick put out his debut album under his name, and it's kind of a pretentious mess of found sounds and noise. If this is truly what he wants to make, then more power to him, but just from the blurb and the description of the album, it's easy to see how unhappy Nick has become since Shadow flopped, and he began to fall into obscurity. In this context, it is fitting that the album takes its title from a style of populist protest that emphasizes the creation of righteous noise using household items, kitchenware, and found objects en masse. Not only is Zanca rebelling against his former creative identity, he's straining against the rote structures of pop music that hold back so many artists from discovering their own true voice, generating a compelling friction between past and present identities, shared experiences, and structures of memory itself. He describes the album as a sonic landscape informed by isolation and world weariness, forming a dialogue with a past in which travel, contact, and chance could still be taken for granted. If you sit down and listen to Cassier-Lazo, it really does paint a picture of frustration and anger. But I don't want to just sit here and take a steamy, critical shit all over Mr. Zanca. In all honesty, I'm a bitter fan, unhappy with the road he's decided to go down, and I'm just as guilty for not accepting his new output as those who ignored and abandoned him when Shadow came out did. That being said, I do think we'll see Mr. Lies again in the future, whether in name or spirit, because regardless of the direction he's going now, Nick Zanca is one of the most talented, genuine, and brilliant songwriters we have ever seen. The dude has a skill set and creativity most artists can only dream of having. That Quiet Friend project I mentioned is another testament to it. It's truly a fantastic record and shows even more diversity and rich songwriting from Zanca. I mean, just listen to this. So with that, I'll say regardless of my own feelings on his current project, keep your eyes on Nick Zanca. His music is otherworldly and genuinely exceptional. I would love nothing more than to see him achieve the acclaim and success that he has deserved since day one. I left a link to his Bandcamp in the description, please show him some support. But with all that being said, subscribe, support me on Patreon, follow me on Twitter, I'll see you in the next video.
It's me, Madison Ray. Playing up your pathetic little babe pitties.